When my son Michael stood up to give his wedding toast, I was still sitting on a secret worth $7 million. And 3 weeks after he came back from his honeymoon, his brand new wife showed up at my house with a lawyer she introduced as just a family friend. She had no idea I'd already had her checked out. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 63 years old. I live outside Asheville, North Carolina. And up until last spring, I was just a retired postal supervisor who spent his weekends restoring an old Ford pickup in the driveway. Nobody at the diner where I have breakfast every Sunday knew what was quietly sitting in an account with my name on it. And that's exactly how I wanted to keep it. Stick with me on this one, because it doesn't end where you think it's going to. If you're new around here, go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from, because folks, you are not going to believe how this turned out. My mother's name was Ruth Hayes, and for most of my adult life, she was more of a Christmas card than a mother. She'd remarried when I was in my 20s, moved to Florida with a man named Elliot Sandoval who'd made real money in commercial real estate. And somewhere along the way, she just sort of drifted out of my daily life. Not a dramatic falling out, nothing you could point to and say, that's where it broke. Just distance that kept stretching a little further every year, until a phone call twice a year was all that was left of us. She never really knew my son Michael, not the way a grandmother should. She sent birthday cards with a check tucked inside, always exactly $50, like clockwork, and that was about the extent of it. I used to tell people I'd made my peace with that. Truth is, I hadn't made peace with anything. I'd just gotten tired of being disappointed. Then one Thursday afternoon in February, I got a call from an estate attorney's office in Sarasota. My mother had died in her sleep. 81 years old, no long illness, no warning. Elliot had passed 2 years before her, and it turned out my mother had inherited everything from him and then quietly built on it herself over those 2 years, moving money around with an advisor she'd hired after he died. I sat at my kitchen table holding the phone long after the call ended, trying to figure out what I was supposed to feel about a woman I'd loved as a boy and mostly stopped knowing as a man. Grief came, eventually, in a strange, delayed way. But right behind it came something else, something quieter and heavier, a kind of dread about what might be coming next. I didn't know yet just how right that feeling was. The will was read 9 days later, in a conference room in Sarasota, with a lawyer named Preston Voss, a careful, soft-spoken man who'd handled my mother's affairs for almost 15 years. I expected some jewelry, maybe a piece of furniture, something small enough to fit in the truck bed. I did not expect Mr. Voss to slide a folder across the table and tell me my mother had left the entire estate to me. The house in Sarasota, the investment portfolio Elliot had built over 30 years, the commercial property holdings that were still generating rental income every single month. Once the estate settled and the taxes were paid, Mr. Voss said a number that made the air in the room feel different, just over $7 million. I asked him to repeat it, not because I hadn't heard him the first time, but because some part of my brain refused to let the number land. He told me there was something else, too, a letter, sealed, addressed just to me in my mother's handwriting. I didn't open it in that office. I folded it into my jacket and drove the 2 hours home, with both hands locked on the wheel, like the truck might come apart if I let go. That night, alone at my kitchen table, I made a decision that changed everything that came after it. I wasn't going to tell anyone. Not my ex-wife, not my brother-in-law, not the fellas I have breakfast with on Sundays, and especially not Michael, who was 4 months out from marrying a woman named Brittany Cole. I told myself it was just temporary, that I needed time to sit with it before it changed the way anybody looked at me. I had no idea yet how much that one decision would end up protecting the people I loved most. Michael had been with Brittany for almost 3 years by the time my mother passed. She was 28, worked in what she described as wealth consulting, which as far as I could ever tell meant she helped people manage money that wasn't hers yet. She was polished in a way that photographed well, always complimenting my garden or my truck or whatever happened to be sitting nearby. The kind of charm that lights up a room for the first 10 minutes and starts feeling a little rehearsed by the second hour. Michael was completely smitten, and I wanted to be happy for him. I tried. But there was something about the way Brittany asked questions that never quite sat right in my gut. Early on, before I even knew about the inheritance, she asked me once, casually, over burgers on my back patio, whether my mother and I talked much, and whether there was family money anywhere in the picture. I laughed it off, told her my mother and I barely spoke anymore. She nodded slowly and moved the conversation somewhere else. But I noticed she circled back to it a few weeks later, tucked inside a question about whether Michael had a trust fund growing up. I told myself I was being an overprotective father, that plenty of young women planning a future naturally think about stability. But some quiet part of me had already started keeping score. And once you start keeping score, you can't stop counting. Wedding planning became its own kind of slow-moving storm that spring. Brittany wanted a venue at a restored plantation house outside Charleston, the kind of place that charges more for one Saturday than most families see in half a year. Michael kept telling me they'd figure out a way to make it work without help, that he didn't want to lean on me. And every time he said that, something in my chest pulled tight. I had $7 million sitting quietly in an account, and my son was quietly stressing over centerpiece costs. I ended up covering a large share of the wedding myself, wiring the deposits directly to the venue and the caterer, telling Michael it came from my retirement savings and a modest life insurance payout from his grandmother. That part wasn't exactly false, just not the whole truth either. Brittany, for her part, took a real interest in exactly how those payments were arriving. She asked Michael more than once whether his dad had come into something recently, always framed as a joke, but her eyes weren't joking when she said it. Michael brushed it off, told her I was just a generous father who'd been saving for this his whole life. I let him believe that too, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through yet. Looking back now, I can see exactly how carefully Brittany laid her groundwork, asking things in a tone that always sounded innocent on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was reading too much into a nervous bride. I was wrong about that, and I would find out exactly how wrong before the year was out. The wedding day itself, if I'm being completely honest, was lovely. Michael looked exactly like his mother's side of the family, sharp in his suit, grinning like a kid the whole afternoon. For a few hours out there under the string lights, I let myself just be a proud father, instead of a man quietly sitting on a fortune the size of a small town's annual budget. Brittany's mother, a polished woman named Carol, who ran some kind of boutique real estate outfit in Columbia, cornered me near the bar at one point and said, out of nowhere, "It's such a comfort knowing Michael's family is solid. Gives everybody peace of mind going into this." I smiled and said something forgettable, but I noticed exactly how she watched my face afterward, like she was checking to see if something had landed. During the toasts, Brittany stood up with a glass of champagne and talked about building real security together and making smart choices as a unit, which struck me as an odd thing to emphasize at a wedding instead of love or partnership. A few guests chuckled politely. Michael looked happy, maybe a little embarrassed, the way grooms get when a speech takes an unexpected turn. I clapped along with everyone else, but underneath it, I felt that same cold, careful feeling I'd first felt on my back patio months before. This wasn't nervous excitement dressed up as ambition. This was someone who'd already been doing math on numbers she wasn't supposed to officially know about yet. I hugged my son that night, told him I loved him, told him I was proud of the man he'd become. Every word of it was true, but driving home alone in the truck, I knew something was coming, even if I couldn't say exactly what shape it would take yet. The honeymoon lasted 8 days, a trip to the Amalfi Coast that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, again dressed up as savings I'd supposedly been setting aside. When they got back, something shifted. Brittany started calling me directly, not Michael, me, which she'd never really done before. She'd ask if I wanted to grab lunch sometime, or if I needed anything picked up from the hardware store, little gestures that felt friendly on the surface and had zero precedent behind them. At first, I told myself this was just a new daughter-in-law trying to build a real relationship with her husband's father, and I wanted to believe that, because some part of me still wanted her to turn out to be good for my son. But the calls kept coming, always warm, always casual, and always eventually circling back toward a version of the same handful of questions. How was I managing things financially in retirement? Did I have a solid system for tracking my accounts? Had I ever thought about consolidating everything into one place so it would be simpler to handle as I got older? She asked it all with a laugh in her voice, the way you'd ask about somebody's garden or their golf handicap. But I spent 31 years running a postal distribution center, and you learn fast how to spot somebody buttering you up before they ask for something bigger. Brittany was doing exactly that, just with a nicer manicure. One Sunday afternoon, she showed up unannounced with a six-pack of the beer Michael always drank, sat on my porch for almost 2 hours, and steered the conversation no fewer than 3 times toward protecting the family's future, the smart way. I nodded along and gave her absolutely nothing. But that night, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd made my original decision to stay quiet, I admitted something to myself. My daughter-in-law knew. I needed to understand exactly how much she knew and how she'd found it out. So I called an old coworker of mine, a man named Gary Bledsoe, who'd retired from the Postal Service 2 years before me and had gone on to do private investigative work part-time, mostly insurance fraud cases and background checks for small employers. I told Gary the whole thing over coffee at the diner, laid it all out plainly. My mother, the will, the 7 million, Brittany's questions creeping in earlier and earlier every month. Gary didn't look particularly surprised. He told me estate filings become public record in Florida the same way they do in most states, meaning anybody with a little patience and an internet connection can find out exactly what an estate was worth and who it went to. It took him about 20 minutes at his own kitchen table to pull up my mother's filing and confirm the number himself, just to prove how simple it was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach turn over. He asked when Michael had proposed. I told him, and Gary pulled up the date my mother's estate had been filed with the Florida County Records, cross-referenced against the obituary listing. My mother died in February. The filing became public record in early March. Michael proposed to Brittany the third week of March. Gary looked at me across that table and said, quiet and steady, "Walter, I think you need to ask yourself if this was ever really about your son." I didn't want to accept it. I told myself it could be coincidence, that plenty of young men propose in springtime, that I was building a conspiracy out of nothing but timing and a few uncomfortable conversations on my porch. But some part of me, the part that had been keeping score for months, already knew Gary was onto something real, and I needed actual proof before I said a single word to anybody. Gary offered to dig further, and I said yes before I'd even finished thinking it through, because by that point I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. It took him almost 3 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable, it was practically a pattern laid out in black and white. Brittany had been engaged once before, 5 years earlier, to a man named Derek Malone, whose family owned a small chain of regional car dealerships. That engagement ended 7 months in, right around the time Derek's father sold two of the dealerships and restructured how the family assets were held. There was no lawsuit, no public mess, just a quiet split that a former sorority sister described to Gary, off the record, as Brittany losing interest the second the money stopped looking the way she expected it to. Gary also found a pattern in her employment history. 2 different positions at wealth management firms in 4 years, both ending shortly after client complaints about her overstepping boundaries with elderly clients. One specifically flagged for attempting to get herself listed as a co-signer on an 82-year-old client's investment account before she was quietly let go. None of it was criminal. Not exactly. Nothing that would hold up cleanly in front of a judge. But all of it painted the exact same picture, over and over. Somebody who found opportunity in other people's money and moved fast the second she sensed real wealth nearby. I sat with that file in my garage for a long time that night, next to the truck I'd been slowly bringing back to life for 2 years, and I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with my mother's money and everything to do with my son's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was getting ready. I decided not to say anything to Michael right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Brittany was willing to take this, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong. I didn't have to wait long. About 3 weeks after the honeymoon, Brittany called and said she wanted to stop by with something important, just some paperwork, nothing major. She said, in that same easy tone she used for everything. I told her to come by Saturday morning. When Saturday arrived, she pulled into my driveway with a leather folder tucked under her arm and a man I didn't recognize walking beside her. A man she introduced simply as Rick. He's a family friend. He's an attorney. He just wants to help us get some things squared away properly. My stomach dropped the second I saw the folder in his hand. Brittany sat down at my kitchen table, the very same table, and slid the folder across toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She explained it as a family protection arrangement, something her financial advisor had suggested, paperwork that would let her serve as a secondary contact on certain accounts in case anything ever happened to me, all of it dressed up in language about love and caution and looking out for an aging father-in-law. She even brought up my mother's sudden passing as a reason to be prepared, said it so gently like she was genuinely worried about me. Rick sat quietly at the end of the table with his briefcase, waiting for a signature that would have given my daughter-in-law legal reach into money she wasn't even supposed to know existed. I looked at that folder for a long moment, and then I looked up at Brittany and asked her, calm as anything, if she wanted to hear how I found out about Derek. Her face changed instantly, the polish cracking right off in real time. She asked what on earth I was talking about, but her voice had lost that smooth, practiced warmth, and something tighter had taken its place. I told her plainly, no shouting, no theatrics, just facts laid out one after another the way I used to explain a shipping manifest to a new hire. I told her about the estate filing timeline, about the engagement that ended right when Derek's family restructured their assets, about the employment history Gary had pulled together, about the cosigner situation that got her quietly pushed out of her last job. I told her I knew about her questions on my porch, her phone calls about consolidating my accounts, every single breadcrumb she thought she'd scattered so carefully over the past several months. Rick sat frozen at the end of the table, clearly understanding this was not the routine signing he'd been called in for. Brittany tried to recover, said I was misreading everything, that this was purely about protecting the family, that any responsible person plans ahead for the unexpected. I let her talk for almost a full minute without interrupting, because I wanted her to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually being said out loud, instead of dressed up in a warm voice on my back patio. When she finally ran out of things to say, I slid the folder back across the table, closed and unsigned, and told her I wouldn't be signing anything that day or any day after it. Then I told her something else, something I'd been saving for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment to put into words. I told her Michael was going to hear every bit of this from me before the week was out. Rick left almost immediately after that, gathering his briefcase without another word, clearly wanting no part of whatever this had turned into. Brittany stayed a few minutes longer, swinging between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was going to destroy her marriage over assumptions, that Michael would never believe any of it coming from me because it would sound exactly like a controlling father trying to run his son's life. That part actually worried me a little, because she wasn't entirely wrong about how it might look from the outside. A father with a secret fortune suddenly accusing his new daughter-in-law right after refusing to hand over any control. So, instead of just giving Michael my version of things, I decided to show him the actual proof, the estate filing timeline, Gary's research, and something I hadn't mentioned to Brittany yet, a recording. I'd started recording quietly on my phone the second Rick walked through my door, tucked in my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me I'd need more than just my word alone. I called Michael that same afternoon and asked him to come by the house without Brittany. Told him it was important, told him I loved him, told him this wasn't easy for me either. He showed up about 2 hours later looking rattled, immediately asking if I was sick, if something was wrong with my health. I told him no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told him months earlier. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, poured him a cup of coffee the way he'd always taken it since he was 16, and I told him everything, starting with my mother's passing and ending with the attorney who'd been sitting in that exact chair 3 hours earlier. Michael sat completely still while I talked, his coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. I told him about the 7 million first, watched his face move through disbelief, and then something closer to hurt, asking quietly why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained honestly that I'd been scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how people look at you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anyone looked at his wedding either. He nodded slowly, taking that in, and I could see he understood it even through the sting of it. Then I moved to Brittany, and that's when his whole posture changed. I laid the estate timeline in front of him, showed him the dates side by side, my mother's death, the public filing, his proposal 2.5 weeks later. I told him about Derek, about the dealerships, about the co-signer incident from her old job. I played him a short piece of the recording from that morning, just enough for him to hear her voice explaining the family protection arrangement to an attorney she'd brought without asking me first. Michael didn't say anything for almost a full minute. He just sat there, staring at the folder Brittany had left behind on my counter, the one I still hadn't signed. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than I expected. He said, "She asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned rewriting your will. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I hadn't known that detail. It confirmed everything Gary had already found, laid out fresh and painful straight from my son's own memory. He thanked me quietly for telling him. Then he asked for the folder, the recording, and Gary's full report, and said he needed to go home and talk to his wife himself, alone. I didn't hear from him for 3 days, and those were 3 of the longest days I'd had since the funeral. When he finally called, his voice sounded worn out but clear, the voice of somebody who'd already made a decision and just needed to say it out loud to make it real. He told me the conversation with Brittany had gone about as badly as I'd expected. She denied everything at first, then pivoted to blaming me, calling me controlling for hiding the inheritance in the first place, trying to twist the whole situation so her own behavior looked like a reasonable response to my secrecy. Michael told her plainly that hiding an inheritance from your own son and secretly investigating your father-in-law's net worth before a proposal were not remotely the same thing, and she didn't have a good comeback for that. He also told me her mother, Carol, had gotten involved, calling him directly to insist Michael was overreacting, that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for him that Carol had probably known exactly what her daughter was doing from the start. By the end of that conversation, Michael told Brittany he needed space, packed a bag, and drove to his buddy's place across town instead of going back to their apartment that night. He told me he wasn't making any final decisions out of anger, that he wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken that he didn't think could be put back together, not after seeing the folder. Not after hearing her own voice on that recording explaining herself to an attorney like it was the most ordinary request in the world. I told him I was proud of him for handling it with a clear head instead of rage, and he said something back that stuck with me a long time afterward. He said, "You protected me before I even knew there was anything to protect me from." 5 weeks later, Michael filed for an annulment, his lawyer explaining that given how quickly the marriage had unraveled and the documented evidence of what she'd been after before the wedding even happened, it was a cleaner path than dragging out a divorce. Brittany didn't fight it much once she understood the recording, and Gary's report existed as documented proof. And she seemed to understand that pushing this into public view would only make her look worse in the end. Carol called Michael a few more times, trying to smooth things over on her daughter's behalf, but he'd stopped picking up by then, telling me he'd already said everything he needed to say. I finally sat down properly with Michael a few weeks after all of that settled. No folders, no recordings, just the two of us at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. And I told him the rest of it, the parts I'd skipped over in the rush of that first hard conversation. I told him about my mother, about the years of distance between us, about the guilt I still carried for not trying harder to close that gap while she was alive. I told him the 7 million had sat there, almost like a strange, silent apology from a woman who never quite said sorry out loud while she had the chance. I told him I wanted to open my mother's letter with him this time, together, instead of alone in my truck the way I'd first read it. We sat there, and I finally broke the seal. It wasn't long, just 2 handwritten pages, but it said more than she'd managed to say to me in 20 years of Christmas cards. She wrote that she knew she'd failed at being present, that Elliot's money had come with a kind of comfort that made it too easy to stay away, and that she hoped whatever was left when she was gone might do the one thing she never could, which was show up for her family when it actually mattered. She asked me to make sure Michael knew he came from people who loved him, even if they were terrible at showing it while they were alive. Michael read it twice, quiet the whole time, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He told me he didn't care nearly as much about the money as he did about the fact that I'd been quietly protecting him this whole time, even when he had no idea there was anything at all to protect him from. It's been almost a year now since that Saturday morning Brittany walked into my kitchen with an attorney trailing behind her like she already owned the place. Michael is doing well, back living closer to me, finishing up a certification program he'd wanted to pursue for years but never had room for, while he was busy planning a wedding for a woman who was really just planning an inheritance. We talk most days now, real conversations, not the careful, surface-level ones we used to have back when I was quietly sitting on something I hadn't found the courage to explain yet. At the same time, I still think about my mother sometimes, about the years we lost to distance and stubborn pride on both sides, and about the strange way her money ended up doing something I don't think either of us could have predicted, exposing somebody who would have hurt her grandson if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see her clearly first. People sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Michael about the inheritance before the wedding, and the honest answer is no, not for one single second. If I'd told him, if I'd told anyone, Brittany would have had exactly what she wanted from the very start, and I never would have seen who she really was until it was far too late to do a thing about it. Staying quiet was never about hiding money from my son. It was about giving the truth enough room to show itself on its own, without me forcing it, without anybody having a reason to perform love they didn't actually feel. Thank God I didn't say a word, because that silence gave me exactly what I needed: real proof, real clarity, and a son who is safe, single, and finally free to build a life with somebody who wants him for who he is, instead of what his father turned out to be worth. If you made it this far, you already know this story was never really about the money. It was about paying attention to the people you love, even when it's easier not to. If this one got to you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe for more real family stories, and tell me down in the comments what you would have done in my place. I'll see you folks in the next one.